I remember the exact sound the bank teller made before she spoke. A short, careful breath, like she was deciding how gently to drop something heavy. I was standing at the counter on a Tuesday afternoon in Lagos, wearing my work badge, still smelling of the office, with a stack of bills I needed to pay and exactly enough money in my account to cover them. Or so I thought. She slid a printed sheet across the counter and told me my card had been declined. Then she told me my account was frozen. Then she told me I owed 8.4 million Nigerian nairas in loans I had never taken, never signed for, never even heard about. I stared at her. My mouth went dry. She turned the paper toward me and pointed at the borrower's name typed in clean black letters at the top of the page. David Williams. My younger brother. The room felt like it tilted sideways. I gripped the counter with both hands and called my mother right there in the bank. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I had just learned. There was a pause. Then she sighed, long, slow, like I was bothering her, and said, "Chelsea, don't make this a big deal." I drove home with my hand shaking on the wheel. I kept replaying the teller's words, the numbers, the name. David Williams. My brother was 24 years old. He still left his dirty plates in the sink and borrowed money for transport every other week. How had he taken 8.4 million Nigerian nairas in loans under my name? And more than that, how did my mother already know, and why wasn't she panicking? When I pushed through our front door, the house was calm. My father was watching football in the parlor. My mother was in the kitchen stirring egusi soup. David was sprawled on the couch, scrolling his phone like it was any ordinary evening. I stood in the doorway and looked at all three of them. Nobody looked up. Nobody seemed anxious or ashamed or afraid. I called David's name. He glanced at me without sitting up. I said, "What did you do with my identity?" He blinked slowly, then shrugged and looked back at his phone. "You're overreacting," he said. His voice was flat and unbothered, like I had complained about something small. That was the moment I understood. This was not a mistake. They had all known. And not one of them had thought to warn me. I sat at the dining table that night and asked for answers. What I got instead was a lesson in how my family had always worked. My mother sat across from me and explained, patiently, like she was talking to a stubborn child, that David had only borrowed my identity temporarily. She said the loans were short-term. She said he was going to pay everything back. She said I should calm down and trust the process. My father nodded from behind his newspaper and said, "Family helps family." I asked them when they had planned to tell me. Neither of them answered that question. When I raised my voice, my mother told me I was being selfish. When I cried, she said I was being dramatic. And then later, when I was alone in my room trying to breathe, David knocked softly and came in. He did not apologize. He sat on the edge of my bed and looked at me with something close to pity, and he said, "You'll survive, Chelsea." I needed it more. He said it like it was obvious. Like my financial life was simply a resource that existed for his use, and I was being unreasonable for caring that it had been taken without my knowledge or consent. I could not sleep that night. At 2 a.m., I opened my laptop and pulled up my credit report. I had not checked it in months because I had no reason to. I had always been careful. I paid my bills early. I had built my credit score slowly and deliberately over 5 years of discipline. What I found when the report loaded made me feel physically sick. There were 4 different loans under my name with 3 different lenders. There was a credit card opened 6 months ago that I had never held in my hands. There was a lease agreement on an apartment in Lekki, signed with my name and my national ID number. The total debt was staggering. I kept scrolling, hoping it would stop, and then I found something worse than all of it. There was a fraud flag attached to one of the loan accounts. A criminal complaint had been filed by a lender who believed the borrower had used false documents. The case was pending. My name was attached to it. David had not just stolen money. He had used my identity to commit crimes. And right now, in every official record that mattered, those crimes belonged to me. The next morning, I sat both my parents down and told them exactly what I had found. I showed them the credit report on my laptop. I read the numbers out loud. I showed them the criminal flag. I asked them to help me fix it. My mother looked at the screen, then looked away. My father was quiet for a long time. Then my mother said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. She said, "Nancy is still young. You're older, you can handle this." She had called me Nancy. She had used my sister's name. We had no sister called Nancy. That was just the word that slipped out, the default name for the child she always protected. What she meant was David. And what she meant by "you can handle this" was that my suffering was manageable because I was the responsible one. The strong one. The one who always sorted things out. I realized in that moment that I was not just the victim of my brother's fraud. I was the family scapegoat. I had been cast in that role long before David ever found my ID card. The loans were just the latest version of a story that had been running my whole life. I called my Aunt Blessing that afternoon. She was my mother's older sister and had always been the most level-headed person in our family. I told her everything. She listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Chelsea, I already heard a version of this story." My stomach dropped. I asked her what version she had heard. She told me that my parents had called several relatives over the past week. The story they had told was this: Chelsea had been financially irresponsible. Chelsea had taken out loans she could not repay. David, being a caring younger sibling, had tried to help cover the shortfall using his own name but had somehow gotten confused with the paperwork. Chelsea was now embarrassed and trying to blame him. My aunt said the family was mostly sympathetic to my parents. I sat on my bedroom floor and stared at the wall. They had prepared for this. Before I even knew about the loans, before I walked into that bank, they had already built a wall of lies around me and called it family concern. My name was being destroyed in conversations I was never invited to join. 3 days after the bank visit, I came home from work and found a white envelope taped to the front gate. I opened it standing in the street. It was an eviction notice. The apartment in Lekki, the one David had leased under my name 6 months ago, had not had a single rent payment made on it. The landlord had followed the legal process and was now demanding that Chelsea Williams vacate the premises and settle all outstanding rent within 14 days, or face further legal action. I had never set foot in that apartment. I did not even know where it was. I walked inside and held the notice out to my mother without saying a word. She read it, set it on the kitchen counter, and told me to figure it out. I looked at David. He was eating noodles at the table. He glanced at the notice and said, "Oops." Just that one word. Oops. Like he had accidentally knocked over a cup of water. My father did not look up from his phone. I stood there holding 14 days of legal deadline in my hands and understood clearly that no one in that house was going to help me. I was completely alone. That night I slept in my car. I could not be in that house. I could not look at their faces and pretend the world was still the same shape it had been 2 weeks ago. I parked under a street light near my office and reclined my seat and lay there with my eyes open for a long time. Sometime around midnight I picked up my phone because I could not stop my thoughts and I started scrolling without purpose. That was when I found David's Instagram page. He had posted 3 times that day. There was a video of him trying on a new designer jacket. There was a photo of an expensive restaurant meal. There was a reel of him unboxing a new phone, laughing, pointing at the camera, writing in the caption that God had been providing. Providing. I looked at those posts for a long time. I thought about the eviction notice. I thought about the criminal flag on my credit report. I thought about sleeping in my car while my family ate dinner at home. And something shifted inside me. I was done crying. I was done explaining myself to people who already knew the truth and had chosen the lie. I was done waiting for someone to rescue me. I was going to have to rescue myself. The next morning I walked into a police station near my office and asked to speak with someone about identity theft. The officer at the desk was a woman with reading glasses and a calm, efficient manner. I sat across from her and explained what had happened as clearly as I could. She took notes without reacting. When I finished, she asked me for documentation. I handed over the credit report printout, the eviction notice, and screenshots of the loan accounts. She studied them for several minutes. Then she looked at me and asked if I knew who had done this. I said yes. She asked me if I wanted to name them officially in the report. I paused. I told her I needed a moment to think. Because even sitting there in that station, even after sleeping in my car, even after everything, a part of me was still holding onto some fragile hope. Some version of events where my family looked at the legal paperwork and finally understood the gravity and stepped forward to confess and fix it themselves. The officer gave me her card and told me to come back when I was ready. I walked out into the hot Lagos afternoon and stood on the pavement, turning the card over and over in my fingers, trying to decide how much hope I could still afford. My answer came 2 days later. My phone rang at 8 in the morning and the voice on the other end identified itself as the fraud investigations unit of one of the lenders listed on my credit report. They told me there had been criminal activity linked to my national ID. They told me a case was being built. They told me that if I did not come in to clarify my position, they would proceed on the assumption that I was the primary suspect. I sat on a bench outside a pharmacy where I had been buying painkillers for the tension headaches I had been getting every day since the bank visit, and I listened to every word. After the call ended, I called my mother. I told her what the investigator had said. I told her that I could be arrested for crimes I did not commit. I told her I needed her to tell the truth. There was silence. Then she said, "Chelsea, don't involve strangers in family business." That sentence ended whatever hope I had been carrying. This was not confusion. This was not a family that had made a mistake and was struggling to correct it. These were people who were prepared to watch me go to prison to protect my brother. I called the officer with the reading glasses and told her I was ready. I went back to the station the following morning with every document I had. I sat in the same chair across from the same officer and I gave her David's full name, his date of birth, his phone number, and his address, which was the same house where our parents lived. My hand was steady when I signed the report. My voice was steady when I answered her questions. But inside, I felt like I was tearing something apart with my bare hands. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from reporting a family member to the police. It does not feel like justice in that moment. It feels like grief. It feels like the final death of something you had been trying to keep alive long after it stopped breathing. But I had been at the station only 20 minutes when my phone started ringing. My mother. Then my father. Then David himself, which told me someone had already warned him. I switched my phone to silent and kept answering the officer's questions. When I walked out an hour later, I had 17 missed calls. My parents' names were at the top of the list. For the first time in 10 days, I felt like I had done something real. By that evening, I had been blocked on every platform by every member of my immediate family. My mother's contact name in my phone now showed number not reachable. My father sent one final text before he blocked me too. It said, "You have brought shame to this family. Do not contact us again." David posted a long, vague message on his Instagram without naming me, but everyone who knew us understood who he meant. He wrote about betrayal. He wrote about blood turning on blood. He described himself as someone who had made small mistakes and was now being hunted by someone he loved. The comments filled up within the hour. People who had never met me wrote things like "Stay strong, King, and not everyone deserves your loyalty." Nancy, I keep almost calling him that, the way my mother did, because he had always been the protected one, was rewriting the story in real time, and his audience was willing and ready to believe him. I sat in a small guest house room I had paid for with borrowed money from a colleague, and I read every comment, and I let myself feel the weight of it. Then I closed the app. I had the truth. Whatever he had, I had the truth. On the 5th day after I filed the report, I received a message from a number I did not recognize. The sender introduced herself as Adiz. She said she had been David's close friend 2 years earlier, before something happened between them that she did not explain over text. She said she had seen his Instagram post and she knew who he was really talking about. She said she had information. I was careful. I had learned in the past 2 weeks that not everyone who reached out was reaching out to help me, so I asked Adiz to meet me in a public place. We met at a cafe in Victoria Island the next afternoon. She was composed and serious. She ordered nothing and placed her phone on the table between us. She told me that David had done this before. Not on this scale, but the pattern was the same. 2 years ago, he had opened a loan under a former girlfriend's name. The girl had been too embarrassed to report it and had quietly paid it off herself. Adiz had seen the documents. She had kept copies because she had felt, even then, that it was only a matter of time before David did it again to someone who could not afford to stay quiet. Adiz sent the documents to my email that same evening. I opened them at my small guesthouse desk with a cup of tea going cold beside me and went through everything carefully. There were screenshots of conversations where David had discussed the plan with a friend, casually, like it was a business idea. There were photos of loan application forms with handwriting that matched David's on fields that should have been filled by the account holder. There were bank transfer receipts showing money landing in accounts connected to David's phone number. But the most important thing Adiz had sent was a series of WhatsApp messages between David and someone whose contact name she had saved as Mama D. The messages were from 8 months ago. In them, David described his plan to use my documents. In one message he wrote that he had already collected my details from my room while I was at work. The person called Mama D replied, "Just make sure Chelsea doesn't find out before you've moved the money." Mama D was my mother. My mother had known before a single loan was taken. She had not just covered for David after the fact. She had known the plan from the beginning. I read those messages 4 times. Then I put my phone face down on the table and sat very still for a long time. My mother had helped David forge documents. That was what the messages confirmed. She had given him access to information he needed. She had advised him on timing. She had told him to wait until I was out of the house. I thought about all the time she had looked me in the eye over the past 2 weeks and acted confused. All the time she had said David only borrowed my identity. All the sighs and eye rolls when I tried to explain the damage. She had known exactly how deep the damage went because she had helped plan it. I thought about my father saying family helps family. I wondered now if he had known too, or if he had simply asked no questions because asking questions might have required him to do something uncomfortable. I thought about all the years I had been the daughter who handled things, who sorted things out, who never caused drama. I had spent my whole life being easy to exploit because I had never once believed my own family would use that against me. I had been wrong about that from the very beginning. I could not afford a lawyer. My account was still frozen and most of my savings had been eaten up by the guesthouse and daily expenses. But my colleague Funmi, who had lent me money for the room, also knew a young lawyer named Emeka who worked at a small firm in Soyulir and was willing to take cases on a payment plan when the cause was clear enough. I met Emeka at his office on a Thursday morning and laid everything on his desk. The credit report. The eviction notice. The screenshots Adiz had sent. The messages between David and my mother. He read everything carefully, made notes in a small book, and then looked up at me over his glasses. He said, "This is fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. All 3. He said my mother's involvement in the planning made the case significantly stronger. He said the fact that I had documentation going back months before the first loan was taken would matter enormously. He agreed to take the case. I signed the paperwork with a borrowed pen, and for the first time since I had stood at that bank counter shaking, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed inside me. I felt powerful. Not loud, not angry, just quietly, solidly powerful. Within a week of Emeka filing the formal legal documents, my parents' behavior changed completely. The blocking and silence lasted exactly 9 days. Then my mother called from a number I did not recognize, because she knew I would not pick up her original number. When I answered and heard her voice, she did not apologize. She did not acknowledge the messages Adiz had sent me. She said she wanted to talk. She said the family could sort this out privately. She said going to court would embarrass everyone and drag the family name through mud that did not need to be disturbed. The next day, my father sent a voice note through a cousin, saying he was willing to settle the matter if I withdrew the police report. The day after that, David himself sent a message through a mutual friend, offering to personally speak to the lenders and explain the misunderstanding. I forwarded every single one of those messages to Emeka. He said what I had already understood: they were scared. The legal machinery had started moving, and they had discovered, perhaps for the first time, that I was not going to step out of its way to protect them. Emeka advised me to agree to meet my parents once, in a neutral location, with a recording running the entire time. He said it was important to have them speak freely before the formal proceedings began, because people under pressure often said more than they intended. We chose a quiet restaurant in Ikeja. I arrived early and sat with my back to the wall. My parents came in together. My mother looked tired. My father looked older than I remembered. David was not there, which told me they had made a decision to manage me without him present, which told me they were afraid of what he might say. My mother started by saying she only wanted peace. My father said I had always been reasonable and he knew I would understand. Then my mother, perhaps feeling the conversation going well, leaned forward and lowered her voice and admitted that she had helped a little with the paperwork because she did not want David to fail. She said it like a confession to a priest. Quietly, carefully, with her eyes searching mine for mercy. I listened to every word. I kept my face neutral. I kept my phone flat on the table with the screen facing down and the recording app running. I thanked them for coming. I walked out of the restaurant and called Emeka from the car. The charges were filed on a Monday. By Wednesday, David had been arrested at the house. I learned this from Aunt Blessing, who called me that morning sounding more shaken than I had ever heard her. She said the police had come just after breakfast. She said my mother had screamed at the gate. She said David had walked out looking smaller than she had ever seen him. My parents were formally notified that they were under investigation for conspiracy and document forgery. Their names were now part of an active case. That afternoon, Emeka told me the investigating officers had requested the bank records tied to the loan accounts. The money trail was becoming visible. Across different accounts, different withdrawals, different spending patterns, the same name kept appearing. David Williams. On Thursday morning, one of the national blogs picked up a short news item about an identity theft arrest in Lagos. It did not name anyone, but it described the case in enough detail that people who knew my family would have recognized it immediately. I saw my Aunt Blessing share the article without comment. That told me everything about where the extended family now stood. I made the decision to share my story publicly after speaking with Emeka and getting his approval. He told me to be careful, to state only what I could prove, and to let the documents do the heavy lifting. I wrote the post on a Friday night, sitting cross-legged on my guesthouse bed with my laptop balanced on my knees. I uploaded the key documents as images. I showed the credit report. I showed the eviction notice. I showed the timeline. I described the night I slept in my car. I described David's Instagram posts about God providing, posted that same night. I was calm when I wrote it. I did not call anyone evil. I did not use extreme language. I just told the truth in the order it had happened and let each fact sit beside the next one. I posted it at 11 p.m. and went to sleep. When I woke up at 6 the next morning, it had been shared over 4,000 times. My phone was full of messages from strangers. Women who said they had been through something similar. Men who said they were ashamed of how they had treated their sisters. A journalist from a major online platform asking if I would speak on record. The narrative had flipped entirely overnight. The collapse of my family's public reputation happened faster than I expected. David's Instagram following, which had been growing steadily through his lifestyle posts, dropped by a significant number within 48 hours of my post going viral. People who had commented "Stay Strong King" on his vague betrayal post were now leaving very different messages. Several of them apologized publicly for defending him without knowing the facts. His friends began distancing themselves with the quiet efficiency of people protecting their own names. My mother's church community was shaken. Her closest friend there called Aunt Blessing to ask whether the story online was true. My mother had apparently told the church a version where she was an innocent bystander. Now those stories could not hold their shape against the documents I had published. My father stopped going to his regular evening meetings with neighbors. Their social world, which had been built over decades in that neighborhood, began to quietly withdraw from them. They had spent 2 weeks managing the narrative with great skill and energy. They had not prepared for the moment the narrative stopped being manageable. The court date arrived on a grey Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the charges were filed. I wore a dark blue dress and flat shoes. Emeka met me outside the courthouse at 8 and walked me through what to expect. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. The wooden benches were crowded. My parents sat on one side, flanking a lawyer I did not recognize. David sat at the defendant's table looking thinner than the last time I had seen him. He had not looked at me since I entered the room. His lawyer tried several approaches during the proceedings. He argued that the loans had been taken with my implied consent. He suggested the documents had been filled out in a moment of family urgency with my knowledge. He described the eviction situation as a misunderstanding between siblings. Each time he made a claim, Emeka placed a document on the record that made that claim impossible to sustain. The WhatsApp messages between David and my mother. The bank transfer records. Adi's testimony, delivered clearly and without hesitation. The recording from the Ikeja restaurant. By early afternoon, David's lawyer had stopped trying to construct an alternative story. There was no alternative story that fit the evidence. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. David was found guilty on charges of identity theft, fraud, and obtaining money under false pretenses. The judge noted the calculated nature of the offense, the extended period over which it was carried out, and the deliberate targeting of a family member. My mother received a penalty for her involvement in forging documents and assisting in the planning of the fraud. My father was cleared of direct involvement but was formally cautioned. The 8.4 million Nigerian nairas in outstanding debt was legally restructured, with recovery to proceed against David's assets. My credit record was formally cleared. My name was removed from every loan file, every criminal flag, every legal document where it had appeared without my consent. The lease on the Lekki apartment was voided. The eviction notice against my name was withdrawn. I sat in that courtroom and listened to each item being read out, and I felt something leave my body that I had been carrying for months. It was not triumph exactly. It was more like standing up straight after a long time hunched over. It was the simple, solid feeling of the truth having weight in a room where it mattered. Rebuilding took longer than the court case. That is the part people who followed the story online did not always understand. Justice in a courtroom is one thing. Rebuilding your actual life is quieter and slower and requires a kind of daily determination that does not make for dramatic storytelling. I started with the practical things. My account was unfrozen within 2 weeks of the verdict. I moved into a small one-bedroom flat in Yaba, nothing impressive, but mine, with a key that belonged to no one else. I returned to my job, which I had nearly lost during the months of legal proceedings, and my manager, who had followed the case, quietly gave me 3 days off to settle in. My credit score, which had been destroyed, began its long climb back. I opened a new savings account and set up a standing order for a small amount every month, the way I had always done before any of this started. I reconnected with Aunt Blessing regularly. I stayed close to Funmi, who had lent me money and asked for nothing in return. I rebuilt carefully, without rushing, without pretending the damage had not been real. It had been real. I just refused to let it be permanent. 4 months after the verdict, a letter arrived at my new address. The handwriting on the envelope was David's. I recognized it immediately, the slight backward lean of the letters, the way he always pressed too hard with the pen. I made a cup of tea before I opened it. I sat at my kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window and I read every word carefully. It was written in the language of apology. It used phrases like "I know I was wrong and I have had time to reflect and I hope one day you can find it in your heart." It was 3 pages long. I read all 3 pages. Then I folded the letter neatly back along its original creases and placed it in the envelope and walked to my kitchen bin and dropped it in. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just with the simple, clear-headed understanding that a letter was not accountability, and words written under consequence were not the same as change. I washed my cup, picked up my bag, and left for work. David no longer had access to my documents, my finances, my reputation, or my sense of self. He no longer had any power over the shape of my life. That was the real victory, not the verdict, not the viral post, not the public collapse of his image. It was this: I had taken myself back. And I was never giving myself away again. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts on the comment.